Let's talk about college interviews. I think that if you are a junior, rising senior right now, if you're not already thinking about interviews, you might actually already be too late for some schools. I don't want to be too much of an alarmist. Let me rephrase that. It's not that you're too late. If you're watching this now, anytime in July, this should kind of perk your ears and get you ready to realize you've got some work to do. So let's dive right in. First and foremost, how many types of interviews, what are the different types of interviews that are out there? I categorize them based on when you should be looking out for them. So the first earliest one, noted, early pre-application interviews. These are interviews typically that you have to sign up for, and they can start as early as April. I put that note for April because I know that Smith College, it's a liberal arts top 20, all female. They start accepting interviews super early. The rest of the schools that are early or fit under this early pre-application interview category are going to be around July. So this is why I'm bringing out the video now. If you are a student that perhaps is applying to liberal arts colleges, the liberal arts colleges tend to be more so the early pre-app. I'd say of all the schools on average that my students tend to apply to, maybe about 5% of their schools will be early pre-application signups. So you should be checking now if this is something that you need to be dealing with. The second type of interview type is the pre-application interviews, and this happens more towards the beginning of the school year, first semester of senior year. So it can happen anywhere from September to December. I'd argue maybe 40% of schools will be like this. Examples would be MIT and Georgetown. Basically, before you submit your application, so let's say it's a regular deadline of January 1st, they're going to have some sort of way where you go onto their undergraduate admissions website, you look up their interview page, and they'll have a calendar to sign up. And so this is something that is more on the radar of some students, just so long as you have a college list figured out and you see which of them are going to ask you for you to sign up for interviews throughout the first semester of senior year. That's what this fits under. I think the prior one, the early pre-applications, are the ones that catch most students off guard because it happens before even your school starts. As I mentioned, as early as April to July. Then the third type is what most students are typically expecting. That's the remaining percentage, 50% of colleges that I experience with students, and it's the post-application interviews. Post-application is what it is. It's basically you apply first. So let's say you have a January 1st deadline, you submit, and then you get invited typically. You are given and you receive an email, which is why, student, it's very key that you, once you submit your application, you don't suddenly YOLO. You have to be vigilant and be checking your email. I remind my students of this every year. Please, once you submit, check your email every day because you could get a post-application interview request. And if you don't respond to that within the first 2 weeks, it's not going to look good, okay? So schools that are like this, Harvard, Princeton, quick little note about it. You're not going to always expect to get a post-application interview. So for example, let's say you're a really try-hard student and you're waiting for Harvard, and then you realize, oh my gosh, Jay, it's been 2-3 weeks. I haven't got an interview. Should I be worried? In my experience, I've seen plenty of students that have gotten in without being requested an interview. The low-hanging fruit explanation for that is sometimes it's just a matter of logistics, especially during the last 2 years of COVID. There's been a lot of upheaval when it comes to the standard procedures. And so I've seen some students that they're literally students who apply to the same school that attend the same high school. So they're like in the same class. Their friend would get an interview, but then he or she would not. And that would create a lot of concern. Oh my gosh, Jay, does that mean that if he got the interview, he's on to the next round, quote unquote, and I'm not? Truth be told, I've seen students in that predicament, that circumstance. The one that didn't get to get the interview request, the post-application interview request, still got accepted. So it's a little hazy as to, and it's obviously going to depend on each college. Just be advised, though, that if you have an interview, the question is, do you want to prepare for it? Do you want to push through with it? If you don't get an interview, I don't think there's really a use of energy of worrying about it, of being more zealous and proactive and reaching out. Maybe you could reach out to a regional coordinator, regional admission officer, and check to see if it was a mistake that you didn't receive. Maybe the emails were off. That can send a more proactive signal. But as I mentioned, most of the times if a student didn't receive a post-application interview request, they're naturally and understandably very concerned about that. They sense that as a bearish signal, like a negative signal. But in my experience, I've seen that actually not really always pan out. Are interviews important? So I think I'd say it depends on the type of interview. There are some interviews where it's purely informative. So there's two types. There's informative interviews, and then there's evaluative interviews. And of course, the third type would be more of a hybrid. Informative interviews are simply marketing. Colleges get more of an incentive to interview students to try to get them to apply, try to create that community outreach so that there are a higher number of applicants. So for informative interviews, think of it more as marketing, and also not all in a negative sense. It's your chance as a student to ask someone who's been trained to teach about their school and their program, a more one-on-one way of learning about the school. But the other type is evaluative interviews. This is where the interviewer would literally send an evaluative form. Sometimes it's like a spreadsheet where, not a spreadsheet, but it would be like a bubble-in thing where you do 1 to 5 of fit. How good of a fit is the student? And you have to write a quick, brief little, maybe 3-sentence comment about what they felt about the student during the interview. That can go into your application evaluation process. And so for schools like Harvard and Princeton and a lot of liberal arts colleges that are really keen on looking for fit, evaluative interviews can become kind of the extra grain of rice that tips the scale. So this is where I kind of give my students an understanding of how to understand, or how do you evaluate the importance of an interview. If it is an evaluative interview, I apply the 5% minus 90% rule. So the plus 5% minus 90% rule is simply, if you are going to be a superstar in an interview and you're going to do a great job, that's more to me like a 5% boost. It's a check mark. Hey, this kid is a really good fit. Maybe you're neck and neck with your pool of students that you're competing with in the part of the admission process that you're in, and the extra interview gives you that extra edge over the rest of the students that they're still contemplating. The other side can happen though, because I've seen some students say, or some parents especially, be like, "Oh, I heard college interviews are important, so you must go do it." But then the student goes completely unprepared, right? It's a hot mess. Student looks super uncouth, doesn't know what he wants to talk about or she wants to talk about. And what that could do, it could be, to me, it feels like a minus 90% rule. Because if you are in that same scenario of being neck and neck with other students and your interview evaluation comes very poor, like all it takes for the interviewer is to write, "not a good fit for our school." And that's game over, right? That's GG. So you want to be careful about interviews, understanding that it's a double-edged sword. It could boost your chance a bit, and that 5% doesn't seem like it's worth the risk if you're weighing it towards the minus 90. But honestly, sometimes that plus 5% is what you need to have that competitive advantage as the higher, especially as you go higher in the rank. So that 5% is something that you want to go for. But understand that the risk of it, if you end up bombing the interview, being unprepared for the interview, could be pretty severe. So I often have discussions with students where I test them out. I do like an interview mock, and I give them an honest assessment about whether I think they can prepare in time to be impressive, to realize that the interview could be a positive for them. Sometimes I tell the student and the parent to bite the bullet and say, just don't do it. Interview types, whether they're important, whether they're not, whether they're informative, whether they're not, you can Google that and you can find some really good resources. Again, I love Prepscholar, man. They do a great job of just providing really good information for people. And so if you're curious, I'm going to leave a link down below. Please give them support. They're doing a great job in terms of giving out free information. And you can see all the different kinds of things that they'll require. Note, Brown sometimes has a video portfolio to also submit. Interesting. So be careful about the additional things that some of the interview procedures will require of you, especially if you're going into certain major choices. I know for a fact that like art and architecture and music, sometimes the interview process involves the music department or the art department, and there could be a portfolio evaluation. And so I'm not going to go into details of those niches, but yeah, just try checking this out. There's also the a link from TheCollegeCurators. Actually, this is my first time coming to this domain, to this website, but I saw that they were keeping a really good track of pre-application interviews and whether they consider them important or not. Long story short, usually if it's a liberal arts school, there's going to be a higher kind of interest in the interview evaluation from the admission readers, but it varies, as you could see. So try checking this out as well. Should I do an interview? Here's what it comes down to. Number one, how prepared are you? Are you willing to put in the time to practice, do it in front of a mirror, do it in front of someone who can then give you honest and proper feedback and criticism? Sometimes some students come to me where they haven't really haven't really developed their social skills to the point where I think it would be strong for certain schools. So what I evaluate, the question here would be, how well can you carry yourself in a conversation about yourself? Do you know how to talk about yourself in a way that's not too cocky, but also not too shy and too silent? Will you be able to exude that EQ and IQ that we're looking for, that really shows the brilliance in you, shows the potential depth in you? And then lastly, do you need to use the interview as a clutch or booster? So let's say, to explain the last question, let's say you're a student who really struggled with grades in 9th and 10th grade, but then you really start to bring up that signal of academic intelligence by getting straight A's in 11th. And so you realize that you have this shaky background academically, and you have a really strong, great social personality. You can really talk in depth and host a very fun, intellectual, social conversation. If you're that type of person, you might want to be gunning for interviews. You might want to use the interviews to bring out that discussion. Say, hey, yeah, I really struggled in my 9th and 10th grade because my father was really ill and blah, blah, blah. You can come up with some sort of reason and discussion there. Later on, when you fill out the applications, you could put in the essays as well. But the interview would be a great place to show that extra clutch factor if you really wanted to put in that effort. How do I prepare for interviews? Get your resume, get your story ready. I always talk about with my students, you need to have a major vision. You know, what are you driven by? What are your ambitions? Beyond just resume flexing, I am the president of this, and I got a standing ovation at Carnegie Hall when I performed on the piano. Ugh, gross. I hear that all the time. It makes me cringe a little. It's kind of cringe. Obviously, you got to figure out how you want to say it in a non-cringe way, in a non-generic or cliche way. And so that takes practice, that takes guidance sometimes, that takes you watching YouTube videos, learning about how do I do a college interview, example college interviews. You know, that really is going to be what decides whether or not the quality of your interview will be beneficial to you. You should definitely be researching the colleges themselves. You will most likely be asked, as you can see in the third bullet point, standard questions, why our college? So if you say something generic like, why do you want to come to Harvard? Well, because it has world-class professors and world-class facilities, and yeah, you just really didn't narrow down anything, right? So you have to be more specific than that. Perhaps Harvard has a really interesting computational biology program, which leans into kind of your major research that you've been doing at RSI over the summer. If you're able to start creating the rationale as to why you want to go to the school, more specifically, I'd say how you feel that the school in question aligns with and matches all that you want to do and more, and will challenge you to grow even more. Like, if you can develop those types of points, then you're on the right track. But yeah, the only way you do that is if you start researching each individual college, their mission statement, their major program, what makes them stand out. If you think about that, you have to be researching not just, let's say, Harvard. You got to be researching Yale, Columbia, UCLA, UC Berkeley, because that's how you know what the differences are. If you only research one college, you might end up talking about something that doesn't necessarily make them stand out, and I can smell that a mile away. Anyways, practice standard questions. Tell me about yourself. If I had to tell you, like, what's the one question, Jay, that you want to do the best you can, prep as best as you can, it'll probably be tell me about yourself. Okay, so many students flub this. They end up being very generic. They don't give enough of a response where then the interviewer can maybe piggyback off of something you said. Oh, well, tell me more about blah, 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 blah. Sometimes it creates awkward silence. So tell me about yourself is really, really important. You probably want to flesh that out and talk with someone, get some experienced advice about that. Why major? As I mentioned before, why college? Your standard, even job typical interviews can come into play. Your strengths and weaknesses. Tell me a time when you were a leader. Tell me a time when you solved a problem. Tell me a time where you had an ethical concern or you had to make a morally dubious decision. Then there's sometimes the fun ones. I really enjoy these, but they're much rarer in my experience when I work with students. If you can go to a remote island and only bring one thing, what would it be? Would it be your book? Would it be your Boy Scout pocket knife? And why? Obviously, why becomes more of the touch point and the evaluative point. And then last but not least, you're often going to be asked, do you have any questions for me? I have some tips about that. It's a very simple tip, actually. A very simple tip of this is don't ask questions that you can easily Google and find on their website. So I heard for Harvard, do you guys have a computational biology program? And if you ask something like that, sometimes that'll just show how shallow your preparation was. Overall, closing thoughts and summary. In order for you to figure out where you are with interviews, should I be worried? Jay, should I start looking into this? You need to know what your college list is, at least like 90% set on what your college list is. My students will end up changing their college list here or there, one or two odd, choices throughout the school year, all the way up until deadline. Okay. But the core list should be somewhat coalesced into your mind, written onto paper, written onto a spreadsheet, typed into a Google Doc by now. And you should be then correlating your college list to the interview procedures for each of them. So this weekend, after watching this video, guys, go open up your college list and literally go one by one, figure out what the interview procedures are for each of them. Number two, determine the interview policy process for each of your colleges. So basically determine which ones are going to be the pre-application, which you need to sign up for now for, or which ones are going to be early pre-app, post-app. Sorry, I'm kind of stumbling on my words here, but I think you guys get the point. Number three, identify your interview necessity or your risk. So as I mentioned prior, do you need the interview to clutch? Or perhaps, are you not sure that you are a strong interviewing type? Before you make that decision, I've seen some students that immediately give up from the beginning, some parents that immediately make a judgment call and say, I don't think my son or daughter is going to be good for that. Or the opposite, I think my son or daughter will be great for that. And then I sit super awkwardly when I do that mock interview and realize, oof, that's not really going to be the case here. Either scenario, you should try practicing first. Practice. Go online, look up online guides, look up interview practice examples on YouTube, and see if you can pull it off. It usually takes 2 weeks of practice, 30 minutes a day, and that could get you to a certain point of understanding whether you could pull it off or not. And then from there, I think you should be asking for honest feedback. You need someone who's not going to be your yes man or yes woman. It's someone that needs to tell you honestly from experience, hey, you've done how many weeks of practice and this was your best? Okay, I know this is going to hurt, but I don't think that you're going to be good enough. I wouldn't say it that way. I wouldn't say you're not good enough. How would I say it? I'd say, I don't think that this would be going to lead to a positive note on your holistic application. So let's see if we can reinvest that time elsewhere. Or I might perhaps say, hey, you know what? Give it 2 more weeks of practice and I think you'll be fine. And I as a counselor, sometimes I want to encourage students, give them the confidence. So I want to always check out the effort of a student before I write them off and say, you're no good. Because I honestly, my firm belief throughout my entire career in education is you want to encourage you. I'm often surprised by how students, when they get that drive and they decide to really commit to something and invest themselves, how much they can improve. So I'm looking for students to start practicing. And yeah, I hope that this was helpful. Guys, go check out your college list. Start looking up what the procedures are. Start signing up early, especially if it's a local liberal arts college. And that considers the interview process to be relatively important to their overall admission decision. Alrighty, guys, thank you.